Everybody's had some adventures. Everybody's had a few close calls. Everybody's got a story. What's yours?
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 33 of Cool Story with David J. McNeil. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your continued support. This episode is a special one for me as it features a conversation with a man who was in many ways at the epicenter of alternative youth culture in Ottawa, Canada, where I grew up. I'm speaking about Eugene Haslam, owner and operator of the legendary live music venues Zaphod Beeblebrox and Barrymore's. Eugene was the ringmaster for the alternative music scene in Ottawa, a scene that was massively important for me as a young and aspiring artist. I'd like to dedicate this episode to all the young people that were part of that tribe, as Eugene likes to call it. What is especially gratifying about all the young people that I know who were part of that scene is that those who survived those years have all turned out to be amazing, accomplished, creative, and caring adults and parents. That is a testament to people like Eugene who created safe spaces like Zaphod's that gave young people like myself somewhere to congregate and share our ideas and passion for music and performance. So, for all of those friends who shared the early part of my journey with me, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Mr. Eugene Haslam. Hello, Eugene. How are you?
I'm swell. How are you?
I'm doing great. People in Ottawa know you very well. Primarily, you're known because for a lot of years, you were the owner of Zaphod Beeblebrox live music venue and also Barrymore's. And so for many years, you were on any given night probably throwing the best party in town. And now you're a country gentleman living in Montebello. How things have changed. How is life in Montebello, first of all? You spend a lot of your time in the summer there.
Since the COVID situation, I've spent a lot of time there because, it's a place that not too many people are. I had come back from France and I needed to quarantine, so that was a good place to quarantine.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed up there. I'm at one with the nature and the trails and all that sort of thing. And it's a quieter life than what I used to live.
Yeah. Was it difficult to make that transition or you were ready for it?
Actually, no, David. One of the things that happened to me some years ago was I had a stroke.
Right. I remember
And
hearing about that.
and that was the start of when I started thinking that I should wind down because I didn't want the thing that I love to do to eventually end up killing me.
Sure.
Although I'm sure the process was something that contributed to it. In any case, I had a stroke and I had to rethink how I wanted to live and maybe detach from it. And so I was trying to wind down.
Yeah. And how are you feeling these days?
I feel good. I don't know that I'm good because most of us have not been able to see a doctor in person for the last couple of years, right? So I don't really know how I'm doing. I know I feel good, but then I felt good prior to my stroke. I had no idea that I was going to have a stroke. So
For the viewer, whenever I do a podcast interview, I always do a pre-chat, 15, 20-minute chat. Ours was a little bit longer than that. We really got into it. And during the pre-chat, one of the things that you mentioned to me was at one point you said to somebody, a group I think you said you were speaking to, that you said, those commercials where you can send money to help somebody in another country? You said that was me. Tell me about those days growing up in Calcutta and how you ended up moving to Canada as a young person.
okay, I'll try and make a long story longer. But I was born in Calcutta in India, and I went to a boarding school, an English boarding school. My parents are Anglo-Indian, or were Anglo-Indian because they're now deceased, which the Anglo-Indians are kind of a sub race of people. They were the conduits between the Indian folks and the British when the British were in India. Many of them were because of conjugal situations and so on and so forth. So my mother tongue is English. I went to an English boarding school, but it was paid for by an American couple who, just like many other people, send money to help unfortunate people in other countries. Now, I wasn't one of those folks that was living on the street or anything, but I come from a family of 9 children. So there were 11 of us, and it makes things tough. And my mother wanted to put us in a good school and found this school that would take us. And so these people, by sending money, helped my education.
So they helped pay for your education in India.
That's correct. And years pass. I'm doing pretty well in school, and eventually my mother was looking for a better life for the whole family, and decided that immigration was the key. And at that time, Canada and Australia were heavily involved in trying to encourage people to immigrate to spur their economies, etc. And Mom chose Canada.
And so did the whole family move?
Eventually, I came by myself, but I already had an elder sister and an elder brother here. So I stayed with them, and they helped get me established. Now, when I say elder sister and elder brother, I mean, they were only a few years older than I am. So I was 15 when I came to Canada in 1972.
Mm-hmm.
And they were a few years older. So, I mean, they were, in essence, young parents of this wacky dude.
Yeah. And obviously things went well in Canada because within a few years, you're a university student. You're able to afford that.
Well, here's the interesting part. When I came, I went to the guidance counselor at the local school, and the person suggested, even though I was qualified for university by my Cambridge O level, he suggested that would be a good idea that I don't go directly into university at that young age. It would have been better for me to sort of coast through high school, grade 13 at the time, coast through high school. But while I was coasting through all of those courses, etc., I would be picking up and acclimatizing myself. So it was actually a very good idea and a great process. On the other hand, I was one of the first of my kind in those times, and I felt like a bit of a pioneer because it was a long time ago, and most people had already made their high school friends, so it was difficult trying to get in. But I was getting 95 in algebra and 92 in another math, and I was smart.
Yeah.
And so everyone in class wanted to be my pal.
Oh, nice.
So I had an in that way. So it was, hey, want to come to my cottage up in the Muskokas? And oh yeah, sure. I'd never been to a cottage before. I didn't even know what a cottage was. And so there I'd be up in the Muskokas, and then when we came back, they'd go, hey, how about we work on this math thing? So it was mutually good.
Right. And so did the family settle in Toronto?
Family came later because we came in ones and twos and so on and so forth. So I didn't see my parents until some years after, when they were finally able to immigrate.
Yeah.
So I happened to be this young guy, well, sort of on my own because I didn't have parents, but I did have my brother and sister as my legal guardians. But I did what I wanted. And in some ways, that was really good because I didn't have those parental controls. But in some ways, I guess not so good because I did a lot of wacky stuff.
You talked about fitting in with the kids because you had this skill and you were able to parlay that into relationships. The immigrant experience as a whole, how would you describe that situation moving to Canada? Was it pretty tough? Did you find it easy to?
It was, being at that age, I was very malleable. And, even though I had that Indian accent, English was my mother tongue, but I still had an accent and so on and so forth. But I was malleable. I was young and I learned things. For example, I learned when I asked someone for a fag and they said, "What do you mean?" I meant a cigarette.
Yeah.
When I said, "You can't do that," they said, "You mean you can't do that?" So I learned pronunciation, not because it was forced on me. It was by osmosis that I picked up so many things. And so in terms of my experience, I guess I was somewhat aware that I was different, but in so many ways, I just blended in and learned. And I'm a fast learner. I'm very gregarious. So I made friends, and my experience perhaps may not be the same experiences of the general immigrant, but then again, it was mine. I made the best of what I had, and I learned. And by the way, I landed in Toronto, so I was my first entry into Canada was in Toronto, and to see this big city, but then again, I also had a friend who later became my partner at the original Zaphod. And Steve and I, we used to go and see bands in little clubs, and we used to buy our records at Record Peddler and
Hmm.
so on and so forth. So, yeah, my experience was quite different, and we did some very oddball things. Even at that young age, I wanted to be not riding with the pack. I kind of forged my own way. Steve and I, we were kind of outliers.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like it. So what did you study at university?
Uh, well, I went to York and I studied psychology. And although I liked it a lot, I realized it was not really for me. So, and also circumstances where I wanted to leave and be on my own rather than living with my sister and my brother. And so I enrolled in Waterloo for
Hmm.
business. And I went that summer for business and did some business courses, etc. But then I ran out of money. I ran out of student loans. My brother was not willing to, sign. And he basically said, you've got to make some plans and you got to smarten up. And so I ran out of money and I started working.
Hmm.
That was the end of my university days, but I had great times at York University and University of Waterloo, and it was at University of Waterloo where, as I was from my townhouse in Sunnydale Place, I had to go by Radio Waterloo, the community station of the university, and I popped in one day and talked to Dave Assman, the manager, and Dave said, "Hey, I'll give you a show." I knew nothing about the technology of doing it, but I love music because Steve and I saw bands. We were into, always the newest things coming out of the rest of the world, and we are buying our records at Record Peddler. So Dave taught me how to use the controls, and I had my own show at Radio Waterloo. So that was a great experience.
And what was it? What kind of show was it? Was it a music show?
It was a music show, and it was free form. I could play whatever I wanted.
Yeah.
So again, because of the types of records I was buying, um, I just played some really interesting stuff. And one of the things I learned very early on was to try and reach an audience, try and see an audience, even though it was audio, to try and visualize that there was someone listening. And I didn't think it was, thousands of people listening. I always projected that it was one person, and the whole point was to entertain that person. And I learned very fast that with radio or with TV or any kind of technology, you can be turned off really fast.
Right. What do you mean by that?
Well, click to another channel.
Oh, I see.
So
Oh, see. I see what you mean. Literally.
right. Yeah. So I learned very early on to keep someone involved. So I would play something familiar, but then go in different directions so that I could take the listener somewhere with me.
So you're working on the radio show. You're getting a chance to share the music that you love with people. Is that where the love for music really took off, or you really became enamored with music and live music, or were you always like that?
It was always like that. And prior to leaving Calcutta, my parents knew this about me because we had the old tube radio was called a Ferranti, which was a brand.
Hmm.
And I remember it always being on in the morning, in the afternoons. And I would listen to All India Radio, but I would also be able to listen to Voice of America, BBC, Radio Australia, Radio Peking, and all these other channels that you get on shortwave. One thing I did learn as part of that process was about news. For example, a news or a world event would happen. And the way it was reported was different depending on whether I heard it on Radio Peking or on Voice of America or on the BBC. And I learned at a very young age that media spins things in the way that depending on who they work for, etc. So I learned at a very young age to differentiate or to look at a story and ask what was the truth in it, because all these different countries' radio stations reported it differently. But to come back to the music part of it, all of these places were playing different kinds of music. So at a very young age, I learned to listen in, and there was also the Indian music and around me. So I was aware of Woodstock. I was aware of Cliff Richards. I was aware of Acker Bilk. I was aware of Tom Jones. I was aware of all these things out in the world outside, and I enjoyed that. I loved. I don't know if you know what DXing is, but in those days on shortwave radio, at night you could listen to stations from very far away, because at night the radio waves traveled differently because of the air and I don't know the technical part of it, but I would listen to radio stations from all over the world. And as a DXer, you write down the frequency, the time, and any other info that you can help the station identify what they were doing. And you send it off, and you it was a kind of cool thing. So yeah, music, I started liking music and being involved in a very technical sort of way.
And how long did you work at the radio station for?
Maybe about a year, and I did some interviews. I was sent out on some interviews. In those days, what was really cool is once you were part of a radio station, the record companies put you on a list, and they sent you all kinds of records because they wanted to get airplay. And they connected you with artist meet and greets. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah. Who were some of the first artists you got to meet?
Oh, the funniest one, and it was the first interview I got sent out to. And in those days, it was a cassette and a tape machine. And I was sent out. I was about, I guess, I'll say 19 or 20 years old. And I was sent out from Waterloo to interview Heart. They were just starting off with their Dreamboat Annie stuff. And they had gotten the opening gig for Loggins and Messina at Maple Leaf Gardens. So I showed up, and they were at this fancy hotel with, the big charcuterie platter and all that for all the industry wigs and so on and so forth. And there were people from Billboard and The Record and Chum FM, and they were all way more experienced at doing this, and I was a novice, so I kind of stood in the back and looked like a wallflower. But interestingly enough, the Ann and Nancy kind of twigged on that this young guy was also part of it. Like, what the hell was he doing here? So and all the big guys with their microphones and their cameras, etc., were just crowding me out. So they took some pity on me or something, because at the end of it all, they said, "Hey, do you want to come in our limo?" Yeah, sure. So I hopped in the limo. They took me around, and then they said, "Where do you want to be dropped off?" And I told them where I was staying, and they let me go. And they said, "We'll see you that night," because they were opening for Loggins and Messina. So I went to the show at Maple Leaf Gardens, and after their set, I was allowed to go down to the dressing rooms and do my interview. So I went down, and I was chatting with Anne, and I think she was really into it, because unlike the usual mainstream media, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. So I didn't ask those same questions that you get asked all along every tour date, right?
Yeah.
So I asked kind of, maybe my questions were horrible, but she was polite and answered. And we kind of had this really great rapport. And I had what I thought was a really neat interview, and I turned around to press the stop button on the cassette tape, and it was already off.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my heart sank. And you know what? Gotta give props to her. She was so kind. She said, "Don't worry about it. Don't worry. We'll do it again."
Oh, wow.
And she did it again, and she had all the freshness of it. And it still sticks with me that she was so kind to do that. So that was one of my first interviews. There were other bands like, Canadian bands like Bond, and it was so long ago, David, I can't even remember all the different bands of that time.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've had a long career of working with
No, I'm
bands, so
just
that's
old.
and that's an amazing story. That's wonderful when you meet somebody like that who's on their way up, or a big a big deal, and they take the time with young people to mentor them. Essentially, is what she was doing in a way.
But that also helped me in my future eventually down the line. And this is what happens, this payback sort of thing.
Hmm.
So later on in my life, when I came across people who were novices, I didn't shoo them away. I tried to, as much as I could, help and understand, because I had been there.
Yeah. What was your next step after the radio station gig?
Oh, I became a banker.
Yeah. There you go. You did a 180.
Well, okay, so here's what happens. I'm at Waterloo. I'm living with roommate, and one of them was of German descent, and had family in Kingston and all over. So they would come down to Oktoberfest. So I got invited to Oktoberfest, the real German Oktoberfest, not
Hmm.
just a drink fest, and it was at Bingaman Park, and it was a very cultural thing. And here I'm a young guy, young university student. We'd go out and drink our faces off. That's kind of what you do, or what
Hmm.
I did. And I'm invited to Bingaman Park, and I see these families, from kids in arms to grandmothers and grandfathers, and most people wearing lederhosen and dirndls, and lots of beer and lots of food and lots of dancing. And that's really where I learned the cultural aspects of drinking.
Hmm.
And so it didn't become drinking, it became social. Drink was part of the social. You drank, you talked, you had great conversations, you danced with the 4-year-old, and you danced with the 85-year-old.
Hmm.
And so that's where I learned a lot of what helped me in later years at both Zaphod's and the Underground and Barrymore's, etc. But what happened was, I met this guy, Bob Smith, who said, which part of Germany are you from? And I said, the Black Forest. And he laughed his head off. He goes, oh, you're so cool. And we hit it off. And he said, he wanted to know what I was doing, and what I'd be doing after university. And I said, I don't really know. And he said, well, if you're looking for a job, I'm in the bank, and the bank is always looking for people. And, let me know.
Yeah.
And I just filed it in memory and forgot about it. But then at some point, I needed a job. So I phoned Bob, and he said, well, just take a plane. He was working out of Carp, which is outside of Ottawa. And he said,
Hmm.
hop on a plane, come on. And now, again, this was in times when banks were hiring, and there was a need for people. He said, just hop on a plane, come out, and I'll arrange some interviews. Well, he arranged interviews. I was all day in interviews, and by the end of that day, I had a job with the bank, and it was not starting from scratch. They looked at me and talked to me, and looked at my education and said, we want you to be a management trainee.
Hmm.
We're going to fast track you. And so Bob and we left that evening, and Bob said, well, you're going to need an apartment, and you got to have sleep somewhere. So immediately we found a studio apartment in Westboro, which is sort of the west end of Ottawa. And it wasn't as gentrified as it is now, but
No.
I found this apartment, and we went out and we got a futon and we got a case of beer. And I remember this so clearly. We were going up the elevator, Bob holding onto the futon, me holding onto the case of beer, and this very pretty young girl was just looking at us. And I looked at her and said, "Oh, I just got a job and I'm moving in." And she looked at me and just smiled.
And
But that's how I started, a futon and a case of beer in
that's how you
Ottawa.
landed up in Ottawa,
That's correct.
the banking industry. How long did you
Yep.
work as a banker?
I dates are very, very fuzzy for me in every sort of way, but
Hmm.
I believe I worked for the Bank of Nova Scotia for about a good decade or so, and they transferred me to Calgary again because they were fast tracking me. People
Yeah.
wanted they wanted managers that was in the boom cycle. So they transferred me, and I was a young single guy. I was willing to go, so I got out there, and I was doing well. I was doing very well. My sister happened to also live there. She had moved there with her husband. Now I had my own apartment, but I remember in the early days when I would go to their place and sit on the front porch, and Ralph Klein would be drinking drinks with my brother-in-law and
Oh,
sister,
really?
and yeah, it was a different time.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was really cool. But I came back to Ottawa that winter just to say hi to friends. And, at that point it was boom cycle there. So when I came back to Ottawa, I was flush with cash. It was natural for us in Calgary to pay with 50 and $100 bills when we were settling tabs.
Yeah.
And I came back to Ottawa, and I was throwing these 50 and $100 bills around, and my friends were looking at me like I was a little bit crazy, and maybe just trying to be a show off, but that's not what it was. And but when I did come back, I ran into this guy who was one of my customers in the bank before I left Ottawa.
Hmm.
And for some oddball reason, he said to me, "Would you be interested in opening a pub with
Hmm.
me?" Or he would be the financer, and I would be the guy opening the pub or creating the pub. And sure, because he knew that I went to England. I saw the Clash. I was very much, my friend Dave, who worked at the bank. We were very much into beers. And in those days in England, there were the Thai breweries like Watney's Red Barrel
Hmm.
and Fuller's, etc. But then there was the microbreweries that pretty well only drew beer, pulled beer
Yeah.
in a 50-mile radius or less. And so I knew all about pubs, etc. And he knew that I knew about pubs, but I knew about drinking in pubs,
Hmm.
not creating them, And but he offered me this, and so I told my banker higher ups that that's what I was going to do, and they were really sad to see me leave, and they said, "Well, if you ever want to come back, please reach out." And 30, 40 years later, I never did reach out because
Right.
I had come back to Ottawa, and I had created the Brigadier's Pump,
Sure. Used to go there.
which
Know
was,
well.
yeah, and I knew nothing about creating pubs, but what I did know was I knew how it should feel. I'm,
Hmm.
I'm really, really into kind of how things should feel in a place. And we didn't want to create a British pub because the Royal Oak was already here.
Hmm.
What we wanted to create, and I learned this from being in England and in Ireland and so on and so forth, is that the pub is not you don't define a pub by how it looks. At least I didn't.
Hmm.
I think many other people do, and they've got to look a certain way. But what I learned about pubs was that it's the landlord and the landlady that make it.
Yeah.
It's the people who come there.
You're the host.
So, yeah, and they are sort of the living room that most little houses in England didn't have, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Right.
yes, that's where I learned pubbing. But okay, so partially I learned it at Waterloo
Hmm.
at Oktoberfest, but then it grew deeper in England and so on and so forth. And so now I was building this pub, and it came out pretty good, I think.
Yeah, it was a great pub. I remember going there quite a bit in university. And were
And
you part of the ownership of that establishment, or you were part of the
no, and
management?
here's the deal. And sometimes bad things happen and they turn around and become the right things, and this is one of those.
Mhm.
This owner had told Dave and I that we would become partners in it, but we never got anything signed. We were young and we were restless and we were enthusiastic, and we never got anything signed. We believed him, and then once these places were up and ready and running, there was the Brigadier's Pump, there was Tokyo Joe, and a couple other things that he did out in other parts. He fired us all,
Oh yeah.
and with nothing to go back to. I mean, I could have gone back to the bank, but I was in Ottawa. I was back in Ottawa. I thought I would just kind of see what was out there for me. I had some savings, etc. So again, this owner guy owned the Chinese Village restaurant on Rideau Street.
Hmm.
And at the back of the Chinese Village restaurant, he had an overflow room or a kind of social room where, say, a party room where, a bunch of people could rent that back part. But now he said, do you want to rent it?
Hmm.
And I thought, yeah, sure. So I rented this tiny little room on Rideau Street at the back of a Chinese restaurant, and I was going to create a place, a little pub. Didn't look great, but we had that sensibility about us, and there was the music part.
Hmm.
So yeah, so I created the underground, and that was the first place I ever did that was my own. And I said I would rent it for 6 months and renew my lease in 6 months
Yep.
if I was successful, and it turned out to be quite a success. In those days, there was no much music. MTV was around. We had a satellite, manually cranked satellite on the top of the building, and so we would get MTV. I, in my silliness and my rebel kind of days, um, thought, well, the thing to do was to again, I had this concept of the world. I was worldly, so we had a magazine rack with newspapers from all around the world in different languages.
Hmm.
And I remember very well this one time, this guy, we had Pravda, which was the Russian newspaper,
Yeah.
and this guy coming in trying to be really cool, and he was reading Pravda, but he didn't realize he was reading it upside down. But that's what cool is, right?
Yeah.
That's where I started booking bands, and it sort of happened organically. I was playing music in the same kind of ways that I played on Radio Waterloo, but then the tribe started happening, and the 80s were happening, and I was all part of it. And these were my fellow tribesfolk that felt safe in this environment. And then bands approached me, I approached agents, and we had some of the earliest bands I remember were Daphne's Purple Closet from Toronto, and
Hmm.
Chuck Angus's band, L'Étranger,
Hmm.
and the Rio Statics. They all
Yeah.
played the underground. Yeah.
Wow. And how many seats were there in the underground, or how many could it?
Four.
Four. So standing room only.
Seriously. Yeah, we built these kind of tables, high tables,
Yeah.
and it was mostly just put your drink on. You just
Right.
stood, and the place was probably licensed for 26, and we would put like 120 people in there.
Yeah. That's amazing.
But it really was about a space and time. It happened so organically. The audience helped me. Um, by coming, and I help the audience by listening and by curating some pretty neat stuff.
Yeah. People who know you, when they think of you, they think of Eugene with his dreadlocks. When did you first start growing your hair out? Was that in those days?
Yep.
Yeah.
Just to backtrack a little, in the early days, when I was a banker, I used to wear three-piece suits, etc. And then I went to London, saw the Clash, and I came back and I changed the way I dressed, even for the bank.
Yeah.
I would wear like green army shirts with epaulets and skinny ties and pointed shoes and skinny pants and stuff. But what was also happening at the time was that this movement, this was happening, which I liked, and so I had a hairdresser guy who was, I just walk in and not even tell him what I wanted. He would just do stuff with my hair, and each time I walked out, I felt, well, it's different, but I can handle it. So I really enjoyed that. And then he left and went to Toronto, and I had unruly hair. So I thought, well, either, I do something, cut it all off. And I did have a Gandhian look at one time then, or I just grow it and see what happens. And then I met this woman who ran an Afro-Canadian products store, where it would be not dreads, but braids and products for African Canadian folks. And she suggested to me that her boyfriend, who had blonde dreadlocks, could do my hair. So I said, well, okay. And so what they did was they braided my hair with fake hair and created my Milli Vanilli look. and I again, this was new, so I liked it. But then what you're supposed to do is tighten these things, otherwise they end up falling off. But I didn't pay attention to it, and what was happening was my hair, as it was growing out, became matted.
Yeah.
And I recall one time I was on a flight to some place or the other, and I got up to go to the bathroom in the back, and I came back down the aisle of the aircraft, and this woman was holding up one of my dreads, my fake dreads, and she said, "Is this yours?" And oh, I was so embarrassed. But after that, what happened was the fake dreads were growing out, and my hair itself was dreading. So I cut off the bottoms, the fake ones, and just let it grow. And I had dreads for about 27 years, I think.
Yeah. So fashion was a big thing for you. It was you were all
Actually,
in.
I was kind of anti-fashion in that sense. I really did not want to, dreads to me were not even fashionable. To me, dreads were, oh, I don't have to take care of my hair.
Okay.
And I don't have to look like everyone else. And at that time, I had dreads. I had rings on every finger, big, huge, chunky silver rings. I had about a good 20 silver bracelets on my left hand. I guess I was doing my own thing, my own fashion, because I never looked like anyone else.
Yeah. Well, in Ottawa too, you would have stuck out in those days.
Oh, I did.
Yeah.
I stuck out in a lot of places, even
Yeah.
around the world.
But for somebody who's into, getting into the live music scene and doing the things that you're doing, that's probably a great calling card for you.
It was, and I guess, I became kind of synonymous with the clubs I was running, etc. And and I still stayed with my musical tastes. I did stuff with CHUO FM, which is the Ottawa U radio station. I was asked to do some stuff with Shea FM, which was the commercial station, not in a music sense, but because I kind of was in touch with the local music scene. I was asked to do like a little roundup here and there, and that didn't last long, but it was interesting.
Yeah. So you cut your teeth in the live music industry at the underground. You're developing a following. Was Zaphod Beeblebrox the next step?
No, I was going to renegotiate my 6-month lease with the landlord who had fired me from the other thing that I created for him.
Yeah.
And he wanted to double the rent on me. So it made no sense to carry on. I was virtually then working only to pay the rent, and there wouldn't be anything left for me. So I quit that. I closed the underground, and I thought that was the end of my musical escapade. And I found a job with the Toronto Dominion Bank, and I was going to be a banker again, a different bank, but that would be my calling. And yeah, I didn't think that I would be doing anything musically. And then out of the blue one day, same guy who fired me, who raised my rent, called me up and said, "I'm closing the Chinese village. Would you like to rent it?" And I didn't want to. And I phoned up my good friend Archie and my other friend Steve. So here we were on Rideau Street, and we were going to build this other nightclub. And but people told us that it was too far from the Byward Market and downtown and so on and so forth, but we didn't care. We were fearless. We just thought that our ideas were decent enough and we could reattract the tribe. And so we painted the place, and on a nickel and dime, we reopened this place. And now we were looking for a name to name it. And oddly enough, I was sitting at a bar on a Tuesday night, and there was only one other person a little further down the bar from me. And I think I had about 1 or 2 beers beyond, the point of that I should have. And this idea came to me, and I turned to the guy down the bar and I said, "Zaphod Beeblebrox." And he looked at me and he took his beer and he moved further away. But I knew the bartender there quite well, so I bounced it off her and I said, "Zaphod Beeblebrox." And she said, "What's that?" And I explained it was a character from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And she goes, "Zaphod what?" So I taught her the pronunciation, and she said, no, that would never work. It's such a long name. It's also starts with a Z. It'll be last in the listings. It made sense. The fact that wherever Zaphod went, he was the uncoolest of characters, yet thought to be cool by others.
Right.
He didn't think he was cool. He just showed up and he was wacky.
Yeah.
So it made sense. And so we named it Zaphod Beeblebrox.
At some point later, did you ever regret naming it that? I remember reading an article with Dave Grohl, and after when he started writing music after Kurt Cobain died, he just started writing his own stuff and he started recording it. And then somebody said, "Well, we should do some shows with this." And he said, "Well, I'm going to call the band Foo Fighters." And he said if he had any idea the band was going to take off and be a big deal, he said he would have given it a better name. Was there any point where you thought, "Oh, maybe that wasn't the best name," or did you just embrace it and it worked for you?
It felt right to me. It felt so right. Everything about it. The thing is, I had read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Actually, backtrack a little bit. I originally first heard the radio series. So, and the books came after. But I knew a lot about Douglas Adams. I knew about The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and So Long and Thanks for All the Fish and all that stuff. So, yes, it made sense. I totally wanted it to be this place. And even though it was difficult for most people at first, what I had learned again in my past was, band names. You think of some of the weirdest band names, and then they become nouns. They become just synonymous with the band.
Sure.
Right. So once people get to know a name, and the thing with Zaphod Beeblebrox, people wanted to know how to pronounce it, but then they also wondered why I would come up with the name. So there was always a story there. There was always some way to carry on. And the nice part is there were people that knew Zaphod Beeblebrox. There were people that knew The Hitchhiker's Guide. So there was a certain amount of intellectual curiosity, and people who know that
Yeah.
sort of thing. So yeah, that was really cool.
Right. Again, your tribe.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
So what year is that you named the bar Zaphod Beeblebrox?
around 1885, it seems.
1885.
No, no, it was when did we open there? It could have been about 1987, 88. I don't know. It was late
Yeah.
80s, towards the late 80s, and we opened this place. And yeah, and we did so many things that are now considered de rigueur or passe, or
Hmm.
that's how things are done. But I remember looking at the walls of this place and seeing that we had so much wall space, but we also attracted such a diverse audience, from government workers to artists to,
Lots of
you
students.
know, just, yeah,
Hmm.
students, right? I mean, I can't begin to tell you how many people I meet even now that say that I made their university experience tolerable, you know.
Yeah.
But this wall space, and we started the idea of asking the artists who were our audience to put up stuff.
Hmm.
Now you see this everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
We started making schedules because we had so many bands. So we wanted to tell the audience when these bands were playing. And so we made up schedules, and that now or later on became the thing. And
Yeah.
in these schedules, we created like a fanzine type of thing. So on the first page or in the middle page would be the whole schedule. But in the other pages, we would have some bios of the upcoming bands, some things we wanted to talk about, etc. And these became things that were picked up religiously each month by customers. So
Yeah.
yeah, there were a lot of things that we did that were, first time things. In those days, and even these days, many of the bars were tied to beer companies on tap. In most of the places, they'd be tied to Labatt's, so there would be all Labatt's products, or they'd be tied to Molson, they'd be all Molson products. And we insisted with the breweries that we could give them X amount of lines,
Hmm.
but we would not give them all our lines. We would not be exclusive to them. We wanted to always be able to, and in those days, there weren't too many microbreweries. There maybe
Yeah.
were one or two. And so we gave them those lines because, again, we wanted to give the underdog. We were the underdog.
Hmm.
So we wanted to help the underdog, whether it
Yeah.
be on whether the underdog was a poet or a musician or anything,
Yeah.
an artist. Yeah.
I back when I was a teenager, I was into the alternative music scene and used to go to there were a few places around that you could go to. One of them was a major minor place called One Step Beyond. So when your bar opened up, I was primed for that. I was ready for that. We had been looking for something like that. And I remember the first time I went to Zaphod Beeblebrox, your store on Rideau Street, was in 1989. I was in university. I was in my first year. I was 19. I met a guy by the name of Tim Johnston, who's still a friend of mine, and
Say
he
hi
just
to Tim.
what's that?
Tell him I said hi.
There you go. Well, you just did. I'll have to tell him that he was mentioned on the show. And so he was telling me about this great band. He had friends that were part of this band that had done well in Toronto, and they were coming to town, and they were going to be playing at this place called Zaphod Beeblebrox. And he said he invited me out, and I went to the show that night, and we checked out the Bourbon Tabernacle Choir.
Oh, yeah.
It was a
I,
great show.
I did many shows with them. And one of the things that was happening was I was offering, and that has always been what I tried to do. There were enough bands playing cover tunes, and we came into being at when I was younger, and I went to show bars. Bands would show up and play the whole week. They would play 3 or 4 or 5 sets a night of cover tunes, and they were there as background music for drinkers.
Hmm.
I wanted a place where bands played original music, even if it wasn't that great to start. This is where they were going to cut their teeth. I was going to be their incubator.
Hmm.
And yeah, and that's what we did. We I looked for up and coming bands, but I also helped young bands that hadn't yet started, or yeah, in a lot of cases, many of my customers said they were going to they were rehearsing, and I said, pick a date, because when you pick a date and you have something to work towards, you create a set, and that's
Absolutely.
how you start. And in so many cases, and actually many of the bands across this country will tell you that Zaphod Beeblebrox, Eugene, Barrymore's, all of these places that I was booking bands at, what was happening is they were playing in, say, Toronto or Vancouver or wherever, and there was a place that they could play at,
Mm-hmm.
especially the Toronto bands. The Toronto bands could play in Toronto and do well enough and fill the clubs, etc. But they needed to sort of hone their skill on the road. And I was the guy
Yeah.
to give them those opportunities. Many of the bands who are even still around will tell you that. I remember years ago, there was another band which disbanded, but one of the band members became a manager out east and called me up and said, Eugene, I have this band. They play all these pubs, but they really are better than that. And
Mm.
we've got to have them kind of break out, and they've got to play your place to show the rest of the country that. And that band was Great Big Sea.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that was, so they played Zaphod's, and then they played Toronto. And one of the things that was happening was the rest of the country was paying attention to this little place.
That ramping up the bar and you becoming known in the business, did that happen fairly quickly?
It happened quickly because I needed to fill these nights,
Yeah.
right? And I was also like any good curator, as much as things come to you, you have to look.
Yeah.
And so, as much as I said that other places were looking at us as being a breeding ground, I was also looking at other places that were similar to us
Yeah.
as a breeding ground. And, here I had come from Toronto, so I knew the Cameron, and I knew Elliot Lefko, who now works for Golden Voice. And he was doing shows all over the place. There was Dan Burke and Derek Andrews, and there was the Bamboo in Toronto, which is a great
Sure.
club, and the Horseshoe.
Mm-hmm.
So and then Much Music came along, and they were playing some really cool stuff. A lot of the stuff was kind of pop, and which wasn't that great, but then they had their alternative shows. I would pay attention to those things, and I read a lot. I would read Village Voice, and I
Mm-hmm.
would read Georgia Strait, and I would read Now magazine. Michael Hollett, the publisher and founder of Now, we're still friends, and in a small way, because I paid attention to, I wasn't waiting for everything to come to me. I went out and searched and looked, and now the US agents were starting to realize that there was this place in Ottawa, so they could book something. When they booked something in Toronto and in Montreal,
Yeah.
they realized that there was a stop along the way.
Yeah.
And so luckily taken on by so many great American agents who,
Yeah.
once they realized that I was a good a man of my word. And this is really odd, because in this business, which is, and I'll say it, the music business is full of weasels.
Yeah.
But the music business also has some really good people. And I rarely ever signed a contract. I mean, they'd send me contracts,
Mm-hmm.
but I rarely ever sent them back signed, because I was always a man of my word.
Yeah. I want to pick up on something you said a minute ago, but this is a bit of an aside. It's it's funny. In back-to-back episodes now, Michael Hollett's name has come up. He came up in the last episode where I interviewed Mo Berg because Mo talked about releasing I'm an Adult Now and it taking off and getting a call from Now Magazine and saying, we want to do a piece on you. And then when he went down to do the interview, Michael said to him, I'm going to put you on the cover too. And he said, whoa. And that really helped him a lot. So there you go. Michael Hollett mentioned in back-to-back episodes.
One of the things is I wasn't operating in a vacuum. There were people, as I had mentioned before, there are things that came after me, like for Phone Electric, but then there were things that came before me, and I built on that, but I built differently. And as much as you can say that I helped, we needed people across the country that could create clubs and scenes, and independent scenes were happening all over. One very good one was up in Thunder Bay, Crocs and Rolls, with this guy Frank Lafredo. I remember when I was managing a band, and we went across the country and we played Winnipeg and Saskatoon and Vancouver. So we all seemed to develop at the right time at the same time.
Right. Well, it's
But
interesting you mentioned that all of a sudden you were a place that bands could stop between Montreal and Toronto. Now, when I was growing up in Ottawa, one thing that was interesting or unique, or some people might have found it frustrating, was a lot of the big bands that traveled around the country never hit Ottawa, and that was the bigger bands, because we didn't have a larger venue. We didn't have a big hockey arena. We had a smaller hockey arena for the Ottawa 67s, but we didn't have a big venue. So if the Who was coming through, there was no way they were ever going to stop in Ottawa. The only time a big band would stop was in the summer at the X, if they could play at Lansdowne Stadium.
do you know why that is?
Why is that?
Population base.
Yeah.
So if there's a reason that X amount of bands can't stop in Peterborough or London, Ontario,
Sure.
or umpteen little places. It's not because they don't have the facilities, but how many people could they draw to the arena? With Montreal and Toronto, they had big arenas, but they also had big population.
Yeah.
So yes, and one of the things is when a band played in Montreal, and you'll know this, when a band played in Montreal, at least a third of the people in that arena would have been from Ottawa.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. So Montreal benefited from that, from being a big place, and all these people coming from all over to Montreal. And Toronto also benefited that way. When a band plays in Toronto, people are coming in from Hamilton and London. So it really the reason big bands cannot play smaller places is because there isn't the population to do it. And so when Ottawa becomes a 3 million population city, I think you'll see more of it.
Yeah. But one thing that was cool about that scenario was, in retrospect, is that when I started getting into alternative music, that those bands weren't going to play the big venues anyways, because alternative music was not mainstream at that point. It was very much niche. When we first started listening to U2, they were a small little band. They played at Barrymore's in town when they came in.
I saw that show.
Yeah, that was the War Tour, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, and
I saw that show, and there's a myth that goes around about that. It wasn't a very well attended show. No, it was a very well attended show, and it was packed to the rafters.
Yeah.
But you're so right, because a lot of the bands that were so well known, they could not play, and many of them were from England and the U.S. They could not play arenas yet, but they could certainly do larger places than Barrymore's.
Yeah.
But Barrymore's was the place that could accommodate that.
Yeah. Well, then that was my experience too, was we didn't mind so much because those are the bands we wanted to see anyways.
Right, right.
So they would stop in Ottawa. So now tell me, how long was it before you ended up moving over to the market?
Okay, so once again, same landlord who had jacked the rent up on me said to me one day that he had sold the building, and who he had sold it to was to Bell Canada.
Right.
And Bell Canada on that corner now has a big, huge building. They needed that footprint of land.
Yeah.
And so Bell Canada told us that we must now leave.
Hmm.
And after putting our heart and soul and our money into this, we were now forced to leave. And Zaphod Beeblebrox, Douglas Adams, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy all seem to make sense
Hmm.
because in the book they talk about the Earth being making way for a hyperspace bypass. And didn't you know this was on file in the Galaxy's record office that was gathering dust, and that these plans were made up long ago, that the Earth was going to be demolished to make way for a hyperspace bypass, and that was what Zaphod Beeblebrox the nightclub was. It was going to be demolished to make way for a Bell Canada building. And so one of the funny things in the book is, or in the series, is, as the earth moving equipment comes, Arthur Dent lays down in front of it to stop the guy from doing his earth moving or demolishing. And it just sort of played into this whole Zaphod
The
Beeblebrox
mystique.
kind of thing. But the reality was that we were no more. And so that was the end of that. And for the second time, I thought, well, there ends my musical adventures. And I went on and tried to earn a living doing some odd things here and there. And every day I would scan the newspapers in the rental sections, space rental, business opportunity rentals, and all that. And eventually I saw this ad that said that there was a nightclub already operating, but it was for rent as is. It was a turnkey operation for the right person.
Hmm.
So I called up and I asked if I could come down and see them, and I was given a date to show up, and I went down and to the address that was listed, and I looked up, and there it said Fairfax Gentlemen's Club. I thought, oh my God,
Yeah.
oh my God, it's a strip club. And anyway, I went up and I talked to the two owners, and they were very nice people, and I felt really out of my league there, but I kind of got them into the idea. And one of the things that he did say was they had heard about me.
Hmm.
They had heard that I was an upstanding and a very interesting person, and what they knew was that if they gave it to me, I would work it. I wasn't going to be just another one of those clubs in the market.
Hmm.
So, but they did say that other people had approached them. So, they'd get back to me with a yes or no in a few days. And yeah, they said yes.
So just to be clear, the Fairfax is upstairs. But you rented the space that was below them, or was that part of the Fairfax at that time?
It was owned by them, the space below them, and I can't recall the name of what it was,
Hmm.
but it was not a strip club. It was kind of like a disco-y Holiday Inn kind of place with lots of neon lights and
Right.
very tacky looking.
Hmm.
And that was the place that was for rent. It was on the street level.
Yeah. That's the place that most people know as Zaphod Beeblebrox. Is some of
That's
the
correct. So
Yeah.
we were, on Rideau Street, we were very much underground.
Hmm.
Now we were becoming something that was well known. And so this person was going to give me, or give this place to me, if I could find the money for it. And I didn't have any, but I approached my other partners from the other place, and um, Steve came on board and Archie came on board, but they asked if we could take on this other guy who ran the Bullseye in the old place that took over the underground.
Hmm.
So, full circle.
Yeah.
So yeah, so we got the money together. We signed a lease for 10 years. No, five. and another 5 and another 5. So like a 15-year lease, but with 5-year clauses.
Right.
But I had no money by this time because I had left the other Zaphods and I had used up all my savings. So I started the Zaphod with the 3 other partners putting in, I don't know, maybe 15,000 each,
Mm-hmm.
I think. And I put in $1.
Yeah.
That's really all I had.
You were going to work it off in sweat equity.
Yes, and they all knew that without me, it was not Zaphod.
Yeah.
So, it made sense. But we had an equal partnership. And we opened up Zaphod Beeblebrox in the Byward market, and that became the flagship later on. And by now, I had learned through the underground, through Zaphods, how to book, how to schedule. And one of the biggest things about Zaphods, David, was not about bands, was
Mm-hmm.
not about booze, was not about anything other than safety. What I had come into being, and this goes back to my days at the University of Waterloo and learning from the Germans at Binghamton Park and Oktoberfest, was that it was about tribe. And one of the things I learned was that there were so many meat markets, guys would just ogle women in bars, and
Yeah.
there was this kind of thing that didn't sit right with me. So Zaphod always had a philosophy, and the first part of that philosophy, I mean, I listed 10 different things, but the first one was everyone should feel safe here. And then I added, especially women. And I got called up on it because if you're saying everyone, why are you singling out women? And I would have to explain
Mm-hmm.
because it's just like Black Lives Matter. You can't say all lives matter
Mm-hmm.
if Black lives don't matter.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So yes, that's why I put in especially women. And then, it was an era when I had to say things like, no gender bias.
Yeah.
No racism,
Mm-hmm.
no aggression. We will earn your trust. We will have fair measures. We won't shortchange you.
Yeah.
Um, we so there were a lot of things. It was a philosophy that it wasn't just a bar; it was a lifestyle.
Yeah. Well, I remember those days too, because knocking around Ottawa, being interested in alternative music and trying on different fashions and haircuts and having spiky hair. And I remember at one point wearing mascara for a little while. You're trying all these
Hey,
things as
you
a
and
young
me,
person.
I did that too.
Well, right. You're trying all kinds, especially as a teenager, you're trying all these different outfits on, trying to figure out who you are. And
Exactly.
so you'll often go through a lot of these different stages, which was fun, but it was also a little scary sometimes because I don't know whether I don't think Ottawa's quite like this now, but I remember in the 80s and stuff, Ottawa's kind of rough and tumble downtown. Be walking down the street and some guy would see me and, yell fag at me. And next thing I know, I'd have 2 or 3 guys surrounding me, pushing me around and stuff. And you kind of had to figure out how to get out of those situations. So when you open a club and you make that part of your ethos, that's a very important thing because those were kids that often got pushed around on the streets because they were expressing themselves in ways that maybe other people didn't feel that comfortable with.
And I'll come back to when I was working in a bank. I wore a suit and tie, but after I left my day job, I'd be going to see bands, etc., and being dressed differently. So one of the things that was very important to me was not how you look, but how you behave.
Yeah.
So so later on, in much later on, when people, I had one of the longest running goth industrial nights in North America, run by DJ Leslie.
Mm-hmm.
And when we first started these goth industrial nights, the tribe came, but then new young people started coming into the fold, and
Yeah.
every once in a while, someone would say, "Well, they don't fit in." And said, "Why?" And I'd be told, well, they're not dressed in black, they don't have black lipstick, they don't have black bustiers, and we're talking about the guys, right?
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding.
Well,
But
that often was the case.
yeah, but I would point out that it doesn't what you're wearing does not define who you are. We were open to having folks who are very different, so we should also be open to having suits and ties in our place,
Yeah.
and that's what we got. I mean, there were nights, so many nights in the bar when you'd look down the bar and there'd be every single kind of person that you could imagine. I mean, so many demographics
Sure. Yeah, I
in
recall.
that
Yeah.
one place and all getting along. So yeah, it was behavior that we wanted to judge people on, and not really judge you. We weren't judging you on your behavior until your behavior was actually forcing us to ask you to leave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the music then. You mentioned the goth industrial night. What were some of the other theme nights that you had that were successful for you?
Well, one of the things, and you mentioned about how, in Ottawa in those days could be a little difficult for someone who was not of the norm jock type.
Hmm.
Um, in those days, we had ska night,
Yeah.
and they were on Wednesdays. And there was a time, and if you Google it, you'll see that Ottawa was a hotbed of racism by
Hmm.
skinheads. There
Yeah.
were gangs of skinheads that would dominate the streets, and they would sometimes come to Zaphod's on Rideau Street and try and get into fisticuffs with some of the other people in the bar. And I would stand outside as little as I am and just stand my ground,
Mm.
because we on ska nights we had sharps in there. Sharp was the acronym for Skinheads Against Racial
Yeah.
Prejudice.
I remember that. Yeah.
So yes, we had all these kinds of things happen. So many kinds of music. And one of the things I learned with music was that I liked a lot. So yeah, I did the first Baha Men show there. The band that sang "Who Let the Dogs Out."
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but you know what? Prior to that, they were doing a kind of music, a Caribbean music called junkanoo.
Yeah.
World music before that term was coined, or maybe around the time it was coined. I was doing bands like Fairport Convention. So I mean, some nights I would do folky stuff. Some nights I would do really hardcore like Monster Magnet or Corrosion of Conformity.
Right.
But here's the thing. Remember, I was telling you about population base. A place like Toronto could have a goth industrial night every night of the week and be packed.
Yeah.
But Ottawa couldn't because, again, Ottawa did not have the population. And I learned that really early on. So I meshed this range of music that I knew with the audience out there, knowing that I could not fill my club every night simply on alternative. So one night I might have this kind of band. The next night I'd have, say, Ani DeFranco, and know that her audience would fill the club. And the next night I would have something like Corrosion of Conformity, knowing that they could fill the club. And the next night I would have Goober and the Peas, which is some wacky cowboy.
Yeah.
So by doing a bunch of different bands and genres, I was filling the club every night with people, but also with different sorts of music.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell us about some of the bands that came through there that were bar bands. They were, entertainers, solo artists, or whatever. That came through your place that became huge stars, big stars. Some of the acts that really flourished.
Oh, so many of them. I mean, a lot of the Canadian ones I'll mention because the size of Zaphod Beeblebrox was not so large.
Mhm.
But there's the Alanis Morissette story. There's Patrick Watson. Arcade Fire played there.
Yeah.
Our Lady Peace and Nickelback.
Yeah.
I get razzed for that, but I'll stand by it. They were really nice people.
Yeah.
And you know, I'd have this there's Sloan and Jail and Sam Roberts and I'm teen. But then there were also bands like Yola Tango and Jonathan Richmond
Yeah.
and Fairport Convention. And I did a really odd one. One day I got a call saying that this Jim Rose Circus wanted to do a show.
Yeah.
And all I could think of, where's the trapeze going to go? you
Yeah.
know? And then it was explained to me, no, it's the sideshows, like the old time sideshow and stuff.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, sure. Yeah, let's do it. And so Jim Rose did a show. And yeah, we had to take so many people out, carry them out because they were throwing up at some
Oh,
of the
yeah, yeah.
things.
Well, I
It's
remember seeing the Jim Rose Circus at the Equinox Bar when I was at Ottawa U, and I was taking a course, and our professor was a Brit. And
uh,
towards the end of the class, he said, "Well, maybe we'll wrap this up earlier." He said there's a circus, some sort of a circus that's being held at the Equinox Bar this evening. And from what I've heard, they do all kinds of ridiculous things like hang cinder blocks from their testicles and and all this
exactly.
other kind of stuff. They do all
Yeah.
this kind of grotesque, gross out stuff.
So I did the
Yeah.
show, and Jim came to me, and it was packed. It was packed.
Mhm.
And Jim said, I open tomorrow night, and the next night was, I think, a Sunday or something. And I said, yeah, we're open. I said, do you have anything booked? No, we're just doing DJ music and stuff. Well, can I have the night? And I said, well, who's going to know? He said, don't worry. All the people that came tonight will tell other people.
Mhm.
And sure enough, the next night was packed.
Yeah, well, there was nothing like that anywhere else, right? It
He
was
wrote
just
about it in his book. He
yeah,
wrote about how the fact that I had booked him then started. So when I booked him, then other places started booking him because now the word had gotten around. So
yeah,
that was one of those things, and there were many similar types of things where Zaphod Beeblebrox was the stepping stone, not the only stepping stone, but integral to the fortunes of so many bands.
hmm The Rolling Stones.
Yes,
How does that happen?
we helped them along a bit.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding.
How did they end up? How did they end up doing? They shot a video at Zaphod's.
Yeah, I happened to be on holidays in Tunisia, and I was up in the air between Tunisia and Heathrow in London, England, when I got a message that the club was booked, and they were trying to get a hold of me, but they went ahead and did it because that's something I would have done.
hmm
And it turned out that the production company, the video production company that was the Rolling Stones had engaged for their video for Streets of Love, had approached us and asked if they could use the club, and of course the staff said yes,
hmm
and that went down and is the first club that the Rolling Stones shot a video at. I mean, they've played at other clubs. They played the El Macombo and the Horseshoe, and
Yeah.
and they're very smart people in that wherever they go. And just recently, if you've been paying attention to some of the shows they're doing in the U.S., Mick Jagger has showed up just to have a beer at a place, a little dive bar, and no one even recognized him.
Yeah.
So they know to do these things. And when they booked Arcade Fire in Canada to open for them, they knew that this was kind of the cool band to play along with them.
Yeah.
So they wanted to get a kind of particular kind of vibe club,
hmm
and we were the ones that they chose.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, the Rolling Stones has a long history of using Toronto and Canada as a second home base. They often rehearse their tours in Toronto. They'll rent
Exactly.
out a space and they'll live in Toronto for a few months and get ready for the tour, and then they'll do surprise gigs at the Horseshoe or other venues. So they've always been good for that.
one of the best shows. I mean, I've done lots of really neat things, and lots of people have come to the club. I rarely got things signed in those days because I always felt it wasn't important. People ask me what was the most well-known or well-liked thing for me, and what bands I like, and I always answered with the ones I had booked into the future. Like,
Yeah.
because I was excited about these new bands I was booking. And I never got things signed. And in those days, we didn't have these kinds of phones to take selfies. But one of the neat things about Zaphods was when people came that were quite famous and celebrities, the audience in the club didn't go gaga over them. They allowed them to just meld in with them. Sure, they recognize them. Sure, they might, have sidle over to them to have a conversation.
Hmm.
But I think a lot of people really like the fact that they could just meld into this audience.
Yeah. One of the cool things about that whole experience as a young person going to Zaphod Beeblebrox was that we had friends that were developing bands, and all of a sudden they weren't playing in basements anymore. They got to play in a rock club. And so, for instance, one of my favorite memories is being able to go to Zaphod Beeblebrox and then later at Barrymore's and see our local friends from Blackburn Hamlet who played in a band called The Age of Faith playing at Zaphod's, and that whole experience and us being part of that and being able to see them grow their crowd and being able to, grow big enough to be able to play at Barrymore's, which we'll talk about soon as well. And that was just a really cool experience. And it wasn't something that we had a lot of experience with in Ottawa, but because you had that place, that was something that could happen. And that was something that we could watch grow.
That reminds me of two different paths here. One is I posted something the other day about Zaphod Beeblebrox or Barrymore's or something. And for the most part, I get people reminiscing or a lot of likes. It's very, they were affectionately known, and perhaps I am somewhat affectionately known. But the other day, someone posted, yeah, and he never gave us the time of day. So I'm sure there are bands out there and musicians out there, and I'm sorry I could not accommodate everyone, but I tried as best I could.
Yeah.
I'm not making excuses. I'm sure there were many bands I overlooked that I perhaps should not have.
Well,
We'll leave that there.
last week I was speaking with my friend Glenn Johnson, who is the singer for The Age of Faith, and he played trumpet as well. And we were talking about those days, and he said, "Well, tell Eugene I said hello." And he said, Eugene was always he was a businessman, and he had to take care of that, but he was always really cool with us artists and very respectful and fair with us. And he said, we'd often call Eugene up and say, well, we'd like to do a show. We'd like to do Saturday night. And he'd sometimes come back to us and say, look, you don't have the audience yet for Saturday night. It's not, I can't do it. We'll slot you in for a Thursday or whatever, but we'll grow it.
Well, I also had strategies. For example, and you'll see that in a lot of clubs. They have a certain kind of band that or type of music that they'll have. Whereas one thing again I learned was that, and I learned it from the Montreal Canadiens of many years ago. When the Montreal Canadiens had a Stanley Cup winning team with Cornwallis and Rocket Richard and so on and so forth, and they won the Stanley Cups for many years in a row, but had neglected to build a bench strength and stopped winning the Stanley Cup for a while. I learned from that what you do, and there's a two-pronged kind of thing. One is I knew we had good bands here, but if I only had local bands, then what would the world know about these bands? Number
Mm-hmm.
one. But number two, what would Ottawa audiences think about these bands? Would they elevate them to the same level? So by having foreign bands come in at a very significant level and having local bands at a very significant level, I gave that stage played host to all kinds of bands. So the audiences in Ottawa looked at our local bands and elevated them to a higher level, number one. But number two, what Glenn was saying was important too, because in a lot of cases, I would see what a band could draw, and then I would try and slot them in so that obviously you maximize the number of people in your club. Um, but I would also, and so many bands across the country and so many publicists across the country patted me on the back because as soon as I booked a date with you or your band or your record company, sorry, your agent,
Mm-hmm.
I would send someone in the band or the publicist, I would send a list of every media contact in Ottawa.
Right. And let them
I
do
would
some of the marketing.
exactly
Yeah.
because I wanted them to arrange interviews.
Yeah.
You know, I knew that if they did some legwork and if they got on, if they got an article in the Citizen or the Sun or in Express or whatever magazines or
Mm-hmm.
were around at the time, even college radio, CKCU, CHUO, that would be helpful. And I, in turn, would make up posters, put up their posters. I would through my sources also, because it was in my best interest also to pack the club, I would do my part and I expected them to do theirs. And together we built audiences. And there's another way I help build audiences for young bands. I would see, say, a band like Age of Faith, I would see them and go, wow, they're good. And then there'd be an upper grade, a grade above them foreign band or some really well-known band, and I would pair this local band with this really well-known band for a couple of reasons. One is because you can then say in your bio, I played with so and so. And number two, the audience of this other band might not have known your band, but now gets to know who you are. So
Right.
that's how you build audiences.
Yeah.
So you build it from a critical standpoint, um, you know, for your bio and for just your credibility, and then you also build in a more physical way for people who buy tickets and like this other band and now start liking your band.
Yeah, and you're also helping bands. You're essentially helping them. You're by grooming them to market themselves
It's
and develop
incubation.
those skills.
Yep, it's totally incubating a scene, and locally, I used to have Monday nights, for example, which were showcase Mondays, and they
Hmm.
were free. And so many bands played these free shows. Now, bands from around the country were asking to play these free shows because they were on tour, and rather than sit on the road on a Monday night and do nothing, they could play and build a new audience in Ottawa. And bands like Matt Mays and I can't remember how many, but so many bigger bands now played these free showcases.
Hmm.
And so I had foreign bands from around the world play free showcases, mostly supported by record company money.
Hmm.
But then I also had Canadian bands that were crisscrossing the country and wanted to play a gig rather than stay on the road doing nothing. And then I had local bands who, you're rehearsing in a basement to no one, but here you can rehearse in a club with a honking PA, and we always, always, always had the best sound techs, doing your sound.
Yeah,
So win, 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 and then it's a win for the audience, and the
absolutely.
audience was seeing new bands and stuff.
Yeah,
So yeah, I really liked doing that.
yeah. What's what are some of the great nights that you remember? And that wouldn't have to be a big band or whatever, but those nights where everything's connecting, everything's happy, just the epic nights. Do you remember a few that were just, wow, what a night that was?
Um, One night that stands out for me more than anything else I've done, and I've done some pretty interesting things. You mentioned the Stones, but Actually, this leads into something else that I want to cover. In the past, when you went to nightclubs, the first band went on stage. They drew it, whether it be management or the bands or whatever. But the bands would start late, the opening bands, and by the time the headliner who you were there to see got on stage, it was 1 or 2 in the morning.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is ridiculous. Like, I mean, I'm in a government town and I want people who earn a living to come to my club. And how can I do this if they don't come because they think it's too late for the band to go on? So I started doing shows at first band on at 9, headline on at 10. That didn't really work, and I adjusted it to a place that we landed on, which was opening bands on at 10 o'clock, but headline always went on by 11. And I got a lot of flack for it, but now across the country, some clubs are starting to do it, but then the CBC twigged onto it because someone in Toronto started doing it as if they were the first ones to do it. But I had been doing it for a decade before. Things like that kind of stick out more in my mind than specific bands. And in a lot of cases, I've been asked, do you have any dirt on bands? And do I? None. I'll put it this way. The relationship between bands and myself was very good. So no one treated me like dirt, and I didn't treat anyone like dirt. I mean, I've had run-ins with some bands here and there, but I think overall we respected each other's path, and yeah, so it all worked out.
Yeah. Did you ever have any real train wreck nights with bands that were just too wasted to go on, or high, or that kind of thing, or was there a certain fair bit of professionalism even with some of the more rough and tumble bands?
Even the rough and tumble bands, when you hit stages that are well known, and Zaphod's was well known, the Horseshoe is well known. Yeah, you do. You put on your best shows.
Yeah, you watch your P's and Q's on that night.
Absolutely, and it's not because I'm the owner. It's because it's because the audience that shows up, and you're playing to your audience.
Yeah. You've been running Zaphod Beeblebrox for a number of years. You've got a tried and true product that the community loves. How does Barrymore's come to you?
By that time, Barrymore's had been closed for about 3 years. Barrymore's was a place that I went to see amazing bands. It was an old cinema, and in the vaudeville days, it was ornate. It was a beautiful space. It was how you want to see a band from, a stage, a big stage, but an audience that kind of, it was a large room. It was larger than what I had, but it had been closed for 3 years. And I had seen bands like REM there. I had seen U2 there. I had put on shows when I didn't have a nightclub. I had put on some shows there. Remember, I was saying that Zaphod on Rideau Street had closed, and I was kind of homeless, not homeless really, but clubless for a while. So I would put on shows at any place that would allow me to put on shows. And that's how I made a little bit of money here and there as a promoter. So yes, I put on shows like Gene Loves Jezebel there. I did 10,000 Maniacs there. One time I called up in a club, or many clubs, and I said, I have this band that I want to put in, and can I have the night? And no club would allow me to do it. So I talked to this young guy at one of the high schools at Earl of March in Canada. And he said, sure, we're having a student event and we'd love to have a band. So I brought in this band called the Tragically Hip, and they played their first show to a bunch of high school students that I promoted, you know. So you're like, yeah, these crazy stories of doing things, you know. And so, yes, I had worked with Barrymore's before. And now that it had been closed for 3 years, I thought, well, why don't I look into it? There are a lot of bands that are going through that I cannot accommodate at Zaphod's that I would like to do at a higher level. And since I had done some of these other promotions there, I thought, why not? So I approached the landlord and my partners, and we struck up a deal. And Barrymore's then was ours for a long-term lease. And I started bringing in a whole new slate of bands. And this place allowed me to, because it could accommodate a larger audience, it was a better production space, and it was better known because, you know, Tina Turner had played there, Buddy Rich had played there, and lots of great, Richard Thompson, all kinds of great people had played there. So when I looked at it, it was very different than Zaphod's. Zaphod's was something I had created for a tribe, for our tribe, and we did our thing. But Barrymore's was a different animal. Barrymore's was a venue, a storied venue with a venerable past. And I just looked at it as something where could I help in, you know, bringing it forward and you know, presenting again some of the current
Right.
bands out there. So really it was more of a resurrection of something and a respect to the people who ran it prior to me, Gord Rhodes and Sherry Rhodes. It was out of respect for them that I thought I should look into it, and I did.
Yeah. I'll ask you about some of the favorite bands that you brought Barrymore's. One that I can recall, I wasn't at the show. My brother was, and I ended up sort of borrowing his T-shirt for a long time after.
I'm going to say
Was it?
Radiohead.
No, but it's the Pogues. You brought the Pogues to Barrymore's.
I got to
Which,
tell you a story about the Pogues. That was in the period that I was alluding to earlier. I had left Zaphod's on Rideau Street, and I was kind of clubless for a while, and I did some promotions. Well, I had eventually run out of money, and I was on welfare. I had approached my friend, told me, look, don't be stupid. Don't have so much pride that you can't go back on welfare. He said, you've paid back the government so much in, you know, in taxes through your banking career. You've given so much back to Canada and to Ottawa. Like, you know, don't feel bad about asking for help when you need it. So
yeah.
I asked for help, and I was about to get welfare. I hadn't yet got it, but you know, I sat with the caseworker, and they took all the information, and I was going to see how I could get myself back on track again. And I got a call from an agent, and the agent said, I have this band called the Pogues. I said, the Pogues? I know the Pogues, but they weren't yet huge. They were, again, just like you two, just like, you know, Sam Roberts or Blue Rodeo. They were, or Tragically Hip, they were working their way up. And the record company obviously thought here's where they break into the North American audience. You know, the album was doing well. So I talked with the agent, and we made a deal, and I talked with Barrymore's, and they allowed me to rent the room, and everything was finalized for the date, and I was happy that I could do this great show that I knew would do well. So a few days go by, and then the contract comes in the mail, and the contract asks for a deposit, and I have no money, and I was almost going to lose the show because, you know, it's specified for the deposit within a period of time. And guess what? The welfare check came in, and I used the welfare check to pay the deposit. So the show was still on, everything was a go. So the night of the show or the day of the show, I'm sold out to the rafters. And I get there early because I want to make sure everything's running fine. I've already done the advance with the road manager and stuff on when they're going to show up for sound check and what they want on the rider, etc. So I'm there early and no one's there. And I look at my watch an hour later and no one's there. And then it's starting to get a little darker and towards dusk, and people are lining up waiting to get in, but we're holding them because the band hasn't yet shown up.
Yeah.
And now I'm getting really, really scared because I think they're not going to show up. Something might have happened to them, and I'm going to have to refund all these people their money that I don't have, money that's being held by Ticketmaster. So, I'm just feeling awful and anxious and horrified that this could happen. And then I look down the road to the direction of Gladstone, and I see a tour bus, just the top of it coming into view, and then this bus just looms in the distance. And I breathe a sigh of relief. And, I tell the folks in the lineup, oh, yeah, the band's here. It's great. Yeah, it's all on. And the bus stops right in front of Barrymore's, and the door opens, and Shane MacGowan and Spider literally fall right up, pour out of the bus.
Yeah.
They're so drunk.
As one would expect.
Yeah. And they look up and they see the club, but then they are at the front. So they turn around and they see the Royal Oak. Well, guess what? They scoot across the street to the Royal Oak, and I'm saying, and then the road manager comes down, and I'm saying, hey, we've got to, you're late. We've got to get this show on the road. He says, don't worry, we've got it under control. And so the loaders that we have, they all load all the equipment in, and the band does a quick sound check, and the show is on. And it is an amazing show. The place is just hopping and jumping. Now, the two of them, they were so drunk, and people who were at that show will remember it, and they've posted about it. It was chaos. They played well, but, Shane was always at the side of the stage quaffing something or the other from the rider. But the show did go on, and it was an amazing show. And guess what? That show made me enough money to book another show and pay the deposit on it, and I was back in business.
Nice. Yeah. Well, that's a great story.
I have to thank the Pogues for putting me back in business.
That's amazing. Well, and that's the kind of show, the kind of show that you just described, that's the kind of show that people would hope that they would get from the Pogues, because that's just the way they rolled.
Yeah, well,
I read their biography, and it's just insane.
It was expected that Shane would be drunk. I mean, that's how it worked.
Yeah,
it was perfect on every level.
Yeah,
and yeah, they put everything into it. Another time, I'll tell you another story. Bo Diddley.
Mm-hmm.
I was offered a show with Bo Diddley, and the agent and we made a deal, and the contract came, and I looked at it, and it said 45-minute set.
Yeah.
So here I was paying, not, it wasn't a lot of money, but it was a lot of money for me for a 45-minute set for Bo Diddley. And so I called the agent. I said, no, I'm going to charge a reasonably high ticket price to recoup, and I can't give this audience just 45 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, take it or leave it. That's what Bo has on every contract. And the way it works with Bo is if he likes what's happening, he just plays. Right. He doesn't play any encores. He just plays. So he said, but the deal is that when Bo plays, you have to provide a backing band.
Hmm.
And it has to be a competent backing band that knows the blues idiom. So I got Steve Lund's band, Mumbo Jumbo Voodoo Combo, to be his backing band. But back up a little, my conversation with the agent was, take it or leave it. So I said, well, I'll take it. And, so
Yeah.
then I get Mumbo Jumbo Voodoo Combo to be the backing band, and the show is looking like it's going to be sold out. I sold a lot of tickets. And so I showed up again early to meet Bo and see what he wanted. But meanwhile, Bo had already gone to the club. And here's this man of significant stature. So I wanted to be there so that I could take care of his rider, the things
Yeah.
that performers want
Hmm.
as part of their show. And so I wanted to be there, but he got there before me. And so my staff member said, well, Eugene's not here, but he'll be here with all the things you need. And Bo said, oh, all I want is a packet of chips.
Yeah.
And that's all he wanted.
Yeah.
And so, I've talked to compatriots who've worked with bands where bands are finicky and ask for this and that and the thorns to be taken off, 200 roses and so on
Right.
and so forth. I've had that sort of thing. And to have this man of such stature be so humble and just say, all I want is a bag of chips,
Hmm.
was, I think, a story that needs to be told to so many bands and to so many people, no matter who you are. Just, be humble. And so anyway, that night, the place packs up, and Mumbo Jumbo Voodoo Combo goes on stage as his backing band. Bo gets on, and they start playing. And I'm looking at my watch. I'm at the sound where the sound desk is, because that to me is usually the best place to listen to something,
Yeah.
to the mix. And he plays, and it's now 40 minutes of playing, and I'm starting to get a little bit anxious. And he plays for 45 minutes, and I'm thinking that he's going to say, well, thanks, folks, and
Hmm.
move on. And he plays for 50 minutes, and then he plays for an hour, and then he played for an hour and a half, and then he played for 2 hours, and then he played for 2.5 hours. And I think he almost played for 3 hours.
Wow.
But as I said before, he does not play encores. He just plays.
Yeah.
He's not sort of like, hey, I'll come back, I'll do one encore, and then if you really make a lot of noise, I'll play another.
Yeah.
He just doesn't do that. He just plays, and then he says bye-bye, and he leaves.
Yeah.
And so it was customary for me to always, and I did that when I was a manager of a and I did that all the time. I would go and say thank you to the performer, and I went into his room. This sounds really funny, but I'll say it. I said, thank you. I didn't know I should call him Bo, I mean, here's a man of much greater stature than I am. So I said, thank you, Mr. Diddley. And he said, well, I had to let those guys off. They were getting tired.
How did you end your relationship with Barrymore's?
What happened there was I had resurrected Barrymore's with the partners from Zaphod Beeblebrox in the Byward Market, the one that everyone knows. By that time, the two other partners who I had started the original Zaphod with, they had been bought out. So there was just myself and one other partner left. And the other partner was more into bar business
Yeah.
than the music business, and we always butted heads on things. But anyway, I don't want to denigrate someone who can't defend themselves, but I will say this: we had a fallout that sort of developed. It didn't just happen, and we decided to part ways. And I still think that he should get credit for a lot of the things he did. So, I mean, he did good stuff on an artistic level. I saw myself as an artist more than I saw myself as a business tycoon.
Right. Yeah.
And so we parted.
Well, that's a good
So,
place for a segue. Not only is your story a great story, what you've been able to do in your career, the opportunities that you created for other people, the entertainment you created for other people, the safe place that you created for young people to go and have a good time that I was able to enjoy. But not only that, but your story is also a great immigrant story. And we look around right now, and every once in a while, there's that wave of anti the other that comes around every once in a while, and we're in that place again, and we'll get through this. But there's all kinds of people coming over now from Afghanistan who are starting new lives, who helped our troops, who put their necks on the line for people. They're coming here to start a new life. You never know who is getting off a plane at Pearson or getting off a plane at the airport in Ottawa, who might be the next Eugene Haslam or might be the next prime minister or the next whatever.
Jagmeet Singh. But here's the thing. When we look at Jagmeet, I'm not sure if he was born here. I wasn't, but I am here. Who I am came from that little kid in Calcutta who listened to shortwave radio, who heard things from around the world, who brought, and, fast forward so many decades later, and I'm still that person who wants to connect the world and listen to the world and hear new songs and new music and connect us through music. And the mantra of, or one of the logos I put under our main logo of Zaphod Beeblebrox was a social and musical alternative. It wasn't just a music venue. It was helping all of us, myself included, move forward in time to a better space and place.
Yeah, well, that's a beautiful thing. And I'm glad you landed in Ottawa, and you were the person to open a lot of those doors, because you opened doors for myself and my friends. And like I said, you provided, as you put it, a safe place to gather and enjoy music and to learn, to be experiencing new bands, new opportunities in the arts. So I want to thank you for that.
But I want to thank you and folks like you that gave me this opportunity. Like, I could never have done this without this tribe that rallied together and made this happen, because there have been other clubs that came before me, and there will be clubs after me.
Yeah.
But the clubs that came before me, very few came to this space that we all occupy. You know what I mean? You were part of it. So I'm just a spokesperson or a conduit for a whole bunch of us that made something happen here.
Yeah. Well, it was fun to be part of that experience. Yeah, it was amazing. I want to thank you for being on the podcast, Eugene. It's been lovely having you on the show, and thank you for taking the time. It's been great. I appreciate it.
Cheers, David.
My thanks to Eugene Haslam for sharing his cool story. It was a real pleasure to hear the backstory of the man who meant so much to many of my friends and I who grew up in Ottawa in the 80s and 90s. My thanks as well to Mr. Jerry Stamp, who wrote and performed the Cool Story theme song and all of the jingles and stings that appear on the show. Do yourselves a favor and look for Jerry's music wherever you stream, and then pop by Apple Music and support Jerry by buying some of his music. And finally, thank you for listening. Until next time, pura vida.
Everybody's had some adventures. Everybody's had a few close calls. Everybody's got a story. What's yours?